The bunting fluttered in the mild September breeze, ribbons of red and blue strung gaily across the green. The village fete of Marleycombe had been arranged with its usual thoroughness. Striped marquees lined the grass. Stalls offered sponge cakes and jars of jam, and the brass band, slightly sharp of tune, had been persuaded to play Jerusalem for the third time that day. Children darted between stalls, sticky with toffee, while the vicar's wife directed the placement of chairs with the same authority she reserved for choir rehearsals. At the edge of the green, in a comfortable deck chair, set a little apart from the bustle, sat Miss Jane Marple. Her knitting needles clicked steadily, though her pale eyes missed nothing. She observed the small details, the way Mrs. Price hovered too near the sponge cake table as though guarding her entry, the quick glance exchanged between young Lucy Armitage and Dr. Leslie when they thought no one was looking, the vicar's tendency to look anxiously at his watch whenever Mrs. Drayton spoke for too long. Human nature, Miss Marple often said, was much the same everywhere, and Marleycombe was proving no exception. The fete committee chair, Mr. Henry Hargreaves, bustled about with an air of self-importance. A retired solicitor with a taste for the theatrical, he enjoyed nothing more than presiding over raffles and making speeches. His silver watch chain gleamed across his waistcoat as he supervised the raffled tickets and the sponge cake, judging with an eye to being both efficient and admired. By 4 o'clock, the crowd had gathered before the marquee to hear the winners announced Mrs. Drayton's sponge. Lofty and Pale took first prize, which she accepted with the complacent smile of one who had expected no other outcome. The raffle followed, prizes including a basket of fruit, a set of gardening tools, and a silver-backed hairbrush. The villagers clapped dutifully, though one or two murmured that Mrs. Drayton's sponge had been a trifle heavy in the middle. Mr. Hargreaves, flushed with the pleasure of being at the center of attention, raised his teacup to make his speech. He began with a few words about tradition, about the importance of community spirit, and about the excellent turnout despite the threatening clouds that lingered over the hills. His audience listened with the polite tolerance they had learned to adopt for his oratory. Then, quite suddenly, his hand faltered. The cup slipped, striking the edge of the table before shattering primly on the turf. Mr. Hargreaves swayed, his lips parted soundlessly, and crumpled to the ground. A ripple of shock spread through the crowd, followed by a chorus of cries. Someone ran for the doctor. The brass band faltered into silence. "Dear me, Miss," Marple murmured, setting aside her knitting. She rose with the quiet dignity of age and moved toward the stricken figure. Dr. Leslie, a young man with a reputation for briskness, pushed through the crowd and knelt beside the fallen man. He felt for a pulse, listened, and after a moment shook his head gravely. "It is too late," he said. "Mr. Hargreaves is gone." There was a collective intake of breath, followed by a buzz of speculation. "Heart failure," whispered one. "The heat," said another. Mrs. Price declared in loud tones that she had always said. Mr. Hargreaves overexerted himself. Mrs. Drayton began to fan herself violently, while Lucy Armitage burst into tears. Miss Marple bent to retrieve the tray that had fallen with the broken cup. Her eyes lingered for a moment on the other cups, still upright and neatly arranged. She noted, almost absently, that the chairman's cup had contained 2 lumps of sugar. She was quite sure Mr. Hargreaves never took sugar. It was a small thing easily overlooked in the commotion, but Miss Marple had lived long enough to know that the smallest things were often the most telling. The fete dispersed in confusion. Some villagers lingered in clusters, voices lowered, speculation running unchecked. The police were summoned, and Inspector Graves, a stout man with a tidy mustache, arrived to take charge. He examined the scene with a practiced air and spoke with Dr. Leslie, who repeated his verdict of sudden collapse. Graves nodded, though his eyes strayed to the shattered cup. Miss Marple returned to her seat on the edge of the green, knitting in her lap. People passed before her in their agitation. Mrs. Price, insisting she had seen Mr. Hargreaves stumble even before he drank. Mr. Fenton, muttering that the whole thing had cast a pall on what ought to have been a cheerful day. Young Lucy, comforted by Dr. Leslie in a manner that struck Miss Marple as just a shade too intimate for a public occasion. The fete ended, not with the triumphant ringing of the raffle bell, but with subdued farewells and uneasy glances. Marleycombe, usually so content in its routines, had been unsettled. Death, sudden and public, had intruded on the village green. Miss Marple gathered her knitting and walked slowly toward the vicarage, her eyes thoughtful. She had seen some things, several things, in fact, that did not. A line, the sugar, to begin with, the tremor in Mrs. Price's hand as she retrieved the fallen tray. The peculiar eagerness with which young Lucy had run for the doctor, though the doctor had already been standing at the edge of the marquee. Little things, each insignificant by itself, but together forming the faint outline of a puzzle. "Such a pity," murmured Mrs. Bantry, joining her at the gate, "to have the fate spoiled so. Poor Mr. Hargreaves, though I dare say his heart was never strong." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple softly, "but one mustn't be too certain. Hearts give out, yes, but sometimes they are helped along." Mrs. Bantry gasped, "Jane! You don't mean—" Miss Marple gave her a gentle smile. "Only that we should be careful, my dear, very careful." That evening the village was abuzz. The post office was crowded with whispered conversations. The inn saw a brisk trade in speculation, and even the grocer's shop was alive with theories. Some insisted it had been nothing but natural causes. Others hinted at darker possibilities. Hadn't Mr. Hargreaves quarreled with Mr. Fenton only last week about the accounts for the church roof? And wasn't it known that Mrs. Price had been displeased over the committee's decision to fund a new piano rather than improvements to the school playground? At the vicarage, tea was served with solemnity. Miss Marple sipped hers thoughtfully, her pale eyes fixed on the fire. She said little, but when spoken to, she nodded and murmured polite agreements. Only those who knew her well would have recognized the faint twinkle in her expression, the look of her mind at work. The police would, she knew, settle quickly on a tidy explanation. They would accept heart failure, or, if pressed, point to one of the more obvious grievances. But Miss Marple had long ago learned that people were rarely what they seemed, and that the truth of human behavior lay not in the grand gestures, but in the small, almost invisible betrayals of habit. And so she knitted and listened and remembered. She remembered the sugar that should not have been there. She remembered Mrs. Price's trembling hand. She remembered Lucy's too eager flight. Above all, she remembered the sudden stillness that had fallen across the fete at the moment of collapse, the way the village had seemed to hold its breath. Life in Marleycombe would not return to normal quickly. A murder, or even the suggestion of one, had a way of loosening old secrets, of bringing hidden truths to light. Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and her knitting bag, knew this better than anyone. Human nature, she said quietly to herself, is very much the same everywhere, and it will show itself here in time. The following morning Marleycombe stirred to a new rhythm. It was not the rhythm of baking bread, postman steps, or hens clucking in the yards, but something subtler, the hush of doors opening just a little wider, of curtains twitching, of conversations conducted in half-lowered voices. The death of Henry Hargreaves had spread through the village like mist, curling into every kitchen and shop. At the post office, Mrs. Price presided behind the counter with an air of tragic importance. She had been nearest the fallen tray, after all, and did not hesitate to recount the incident to each customer in turn. "A dreadful shock," she said, pursing her lips. "I was the first to see his hands shake. He looked as white as paper. I dare say it was the heat, but still, one never knows with men of his age." The baker, collecting his letters, murmured that he had heard otherwise, that Mr. Hargreaves had taken his tea with sugar, though he never did at home. Mrs. Price dismissed this with a sniff, but a small smile crept about her mouth. "People talk," she said, "but I always say one must stick to facts. And the fact is, he had been pale for weeks. Overwork, perhaps. He was forever fussing over the committee." From behind her knitting basket, seated quietly by the window, Miss Marple listened. She had come for her morning paper, but she found the post office that morning more instructive than any newspaper. Gossip was a crude instrument, but, like the village pump, it always brought something up from the depths. Outside, Mrs. Drayton was telling anyone who would listen that her prize sponge had been ruined by the tragedy. One bakes, one presents, one wins only to have it all forgotten in a collapse. Such a pity. And of course Henry always admired my baking. I dare say he ate too much of it yesterday. Poor man. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though her glance was sharp, as if daring contradiction. Others gathered near the churchyard gate. Mr. Fenton, a bluff farmer, insisted the death had nothing to do with food or sugar. It was his heart. I told him so. Last week. Too fond of speeches, not enough walking in the field. Men kill themselves with talk. His neighbor muttered something about church roof funds, but Mr. Fenton waved it away. A storm in a teacup, that business. Nothing to do with his death. Yet everyone remembered that the quarrel between Mr. Fenton and Mr. Hargreaves had been loud enough to echo down the high street. By midday, the police had made their presence felt. Inspector Graves strode about with authority, questioning witnesses and taking notes in a small leather book. He summoned Dr. Leslie to the inn parlor for a private conference, though villagers loitered nearby in hopes of overhearing. The doctor, neat in his dark suit, emerged shortly after with a grave expression. "Natural causes," he said briefly, and mounted his bicycle. The pronouncement, instead of calming the village, only inflamed further speculation. Natural causes could mean anything, after all. Heart trouble, shock, indigestion, even a hidden weakness. Each theory was embroidered and passed along until no two households repeated it the same way. Miss Marple spent the afternoon at the vicarage, sipping tea with Mrs. Bantry and the vicar's wife. The drawing room was full of flowers, though the scent seemed somehow oppressive. "A dreadful affair," sighed Mrs. Bantry, smoothing her skirt. "And right in front of everyone? Such things do not happen at village fêtes. Or at least," she added, lowering her voice, "they should not." The vicar's wife, pale and fluttery, agreed. "Poor Mr. Hargreaves. Though I confess I never liked the way he spoke to the choir. Always a little sharp, I thought. Still, one mustn't speak ill of the dead." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. She did not contradict either woman. Instead, she asked, in her gentle way, "And who was it poured Mr. Hargreaves's tea yesterday?" "I did not quite see." "Ah, Mrs. Price." "Of course," said the vicar's wife. "She always does at committee events. Though I noticed she seemed flustered yesterday, dropping her spoon and all. But then she's easily flustered." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "I had thought young Lucy Armitage helped. Did she not bring the tray forward?" Yes. That's right," the vicar's wife agreed vaguely. "She is such a helpful girl. Very attentive to Dr. Leslie, I fancy." She smiled, but there was a hint of disapproval in it. Miss Marple's needles clicked. Helpful girls, in her experience, were sometimes helpful to themselves, most of all. As evening fell, the atmosphere in Marleycombe grew heavier. At the inn, voices rose as cider loosened tongues. Some swore that Mr. Hargreaves had enemies beyond the village, that his legal dealings in the city had left more than one man embittered. Others claimed he had been on the verge of announcing a most unwelcome change in committee funds. A few, lowering their voices to whispers, suggested poison. Miss Marple, walking home along the lane, passed the inn just in time to hear the word. She paused in the shadow of a hedge, unnoticed. Poison, a small, ugly word, but not unknown to her. Many poisons were easy to obtain, especially in villages where gardens and sheds held substances as potent as any chemist's vial. And poison was, above all, the weapon of the discreet. She resumed her walk, the twilight soft around her, the thatched cottages glowed with lamplight, the air smelled of damp earth and wood smoke. Yet beneath the calm she felt a shift, a current of unease. Villages thrived on order, on the expectation that tomorrow would resemble today. A sudden death disrupted that pattern, and with disruption came fear. At her own small cottage, Miss Marple set her kettle to boil and laid out her knitting. She reviewed in her mind the fragments gathered through the day, Mrs. Price's insistence, Mrs. Drayton's self-pity, Mr. Fenton's defensiveness, Lucy Armitage's helpfulness, Dr. Leslie's brisk verdict. Each piece was small, but they fitted together with a curious lack of harmony. People do not always tell lies, she murmured to herself, but they very often tell the truth in a way that suits them. She remembered distinctly, Henry Hargreaves never took sugar. She had heard him say so more than once, and she had watched him decline it with a fastidious gesture. Why then had his cup contained not one but 2 lumps? It might be nothing. Someone might have muddled the cups in the bustle, but Miss Marple, who had watched human muddles all her life, felt certain this was no accident. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was the vicar, tall and solemn. "Forgive the intrusion, Miss Marple. I thought perhaps you might wish to hear. The inspector has asked for an inquest." "It will be held on Thursday." "Quite proper," said Miss Marple, pouring him tea. "And in the meantime, what does Inspector Graves think?" The vicar hesitated. "That it was a seizure of the heart. He sees no reason to look further." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Policemen are so fortunate in their certainty. I find life seldom so obliging." And the vicar looked puzzled, but Miss Marple only smiled and offered him a slice of seed cake. Later, when he had gone, she sat long by the fire, her needles at rest. She thought of Henry Hargreaves, lying now cold in the undertaker's care. A man may fall from a weak heart, yes, but a man may also fall when someone else has determined he shall. In Marleycombe, behind its lace curtains and polished brass, there were secrets. She could almost feel them stirring like moths in the dark. And sooner or later those secrets would flutter into the open. For now the village whispered at its gates, and Miss Marple listened. On Tuesday morning, the day after the inquest was announced, Marleycombe awoke to a restless calm. Clouds hung low over the fields, as though the weather itself had decided to brood. The shops opened as usual. The children trudged to school, yet something strained lay beneath the ordinary rhythms. People lingered longer in conversation, eyes shifting, voices dropping when others drew near. Miss Marple, never one to waste a morning, tied on her bonnet and set out with a small basket ostensibly for errands. She always said one learns more on a shopping round than at any official interview. And so she went, knitting bag tucked beneath her arm, a benign figure, pausing here and there to greet acquaintances. Her first stop was the grocer's, where young Lucy Armitage was already at the counter, asking for flour. She looked pale, her hands restless. When she saw Miss Marple, she offered a quick, nervous smile. "Such a terrible business, isn't it?" Lucy said. "I can hardly think of anything else." "Indeed, my dear," said Miss Marple gently. "And you were so very helpful, running for the doctor as you did. Though, if you'll forgive an old woman's memory, I had thought Dr. Leslie was already near at hand." Lucy flushed. "Oh, yes, but I wanted to fetch him directly. It seemed the thing to do." "Of course," said Miss Marple. She added nothing more, but tucked the remark away in her mind. People often explained themselves too quickly when they were uneasy. From the grocer's, she went to the bakery, where Mrs. Drayton was expounding her theory to a small audience. "It was his constitution," she declared, patting her ample bosom. "I always said Henry Hargreaves worked too hard. And the man was a dreadful worrier. Why, only last week he was fretting over raffle tickets, as if the fate of the empire depended on them." "Raffle tickets?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "Why, yes. There had been some muddle missing numbers, or so he claimed. I dare say he imagined theft where there was none, poor man. It preyed upon his mind." Miss Marple purchased a small loaf, thanked the baker, and moved on. Missing raffle tickets. That was interesting. It was the sort of detail people mentioned casually, but which often concealed more. At the churchyard she encountered Mr. Fenton, who leaned on the gate smoking his pipe. He greeted her with gruff courtesy. "A sad end," he said, "though I can't pretend I mourn him overmuch. Hargreaves was a meddler, always poking his nose in parish accounts. Accused me of mislaying funds. Would you believe it? As though I couldn't add 2 figures. People do worry dreadfully over money," Miss Marple said. "And sometimes where money's concerned, tempers flare. But it must be a comfort to you, Mr. Fenton, that his suspicions will trouble you no longer." He scowled. "Comfort, eh? I'll tell you this. If anyone had a quarrel with the man, it wasn't me alone. Ask Mrs. Price about her committee vote last month. Or Dr. Leslie, come to that. He was furious when Hargreaves opposed the new surgery fund." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. But in her mind, she pictured the scene at the fete again. Mr. Fenton's broad face turning red. His booming voice declaring that the committee chair was a pompous fool. Quarrels had a way of lingering, however heartily a man puffed on his pipe afterward. Later, Miss Marple visited the vicarage, where the vicar's wife received her in a state of nervous hospitality. Tea was poured, biscuits offered, but the lady's eyes wandered constantly to the clock. "Such trying days," she said, fluttering. "Inspector Graves has been quite busy. He was here only this morning asking endless questions. He seems convinced it was natural causes, yet he takes notes as though preparing for a great trial. One hardly knows what to think." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And you, yourself, my dear? You were near the tea-table, I believe. Did you observe anything particular?" "Oh, nothing at all. Except that Mrs. Price nearly dropped the tray. She is so clumsy. And Lucy Armitage was hovering, which I thought unusual. She's normally such a shy girl." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Shy girls, in my experience, sometimes find courage when they are strongly motivated." The vicar's wife looked puzzled, but Miss Marple said no more. That afternoon, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet hour in her garden. She weeded, snipped, and reflected, her mind moving as carefully as her hands. What had she so far? Sugar in the tea, Henry Hargreaves never took it, yet his cup had 2 lumps. Mrs. Price's trembling, not mere clumsiness, but nervousness, perhaps. Lucy's eagerness, running for the doctor, though he was already nearby. Raffle muddle, missing tickets, possibly connected with money. Quarrels with Mr. Fenton over accounts, with Dr. Leslie over surgery funds, with Mrs. Price over committee votes. It was enough to suggest that Henry Hargreaves had been less beloved than the polite condolences implied, and it was enough to suggest that his death might not be the simple collapse Inspector Graves assumed. The next morning brought fresh news. At the inn, a chambermaid whispered that the police had taken away the broken cup. Testing it, they say, she told Mrs. Bantry, for poison. The word traveled fast. By noon, poison was on every tongue in Marleycombe. Rat poison, weed killer, medicine, everyone had a theory about what might be lurking in sheds and cupboards. Miss Marple, meeting Mrs. Drayton at the grocer's, listened as the woman declared with certainty that arsenic must be to blame. I read of it once in the paper. A lady killed her husband with arsenic in his tea. Such a wicked thing. Yes, Miss Marple agreed gently. Wicked and usually chosen by someone who knows her victim's habits very well. Mrs. Drayton looked startled, then bustled off with her basket. That evening, Miss Marple received a visitor, young Lucy, pale and agitated. She perched on the edge of the chair, twisting her handkerchief. Miss Marple, you must tell me, do they think it was poison? My dear, rumors are seldom to be trusted, but the police will examine all possibilities. Lucy bit her lip. It wasn't me. I only carried the tray. Everyone says I brought his cup, but it wasn't me, truly. Mrs. Price poured it. I just handed it over. Miss Marple regarded her kindly. And why are you so anxious, child, if you did nothing? Because they look at me, Lucy whispered. Because I was near. And because I didn't want Mr. Hargreaves to die, but I wasn't sorry either. He made life so difficult for Dr. Leslie, always opposing him, always finding fault. I hated it. I thought if he weren't there, things would be easier. But I never meant, she broke off, flushing. Miss Marple patted her hand. We cannot help what we think, my dear. It is what we do that matters. And you have told me something important, that Mrs. Price poured the tea. That is a fact to be remembered. When Lucy had gone, Miss Marple sat quietly for a long time. One more piece had fallen into place. But the pattern, as yet, was far from clear. That night, the village seemed to hold its breath. Windows glowed with lamplight, doors shut firmly, voices hushed behind curtains. Everyone was waiting for Thursday's inquest, waiting for the inspector's verdict, waiting, though they would hardly admit it, for Miss Marple's thoughts. For when Miss Marple grew thoughtful, Marleycombe had learned something beneath the surface was bound to be revealed, and Miss Marple was very thoughtful indeed. Thursday dawned with a thin, colorless light and the sound of crows over the fields. By 10 o'clock, half of Marleycombe had found business that led, quite innocently, past the village hall, where the coroner took his seat and Inspector Graves arranged his papers with an air of capable gravity. The vicar sat straight-backed. Mrs. Bantry composed her features into a look of restrained sorrow. And Mrs. Price, trim as a paper knife, had the dignities, some would say, the relish, of an important witness. Miss Marple slipped into a back bench, quiet and self-effacing. She regarded the small company with that mild attention of hers which had so often proven sharper than a magistrate's eye. Dr. Leslie was called first. He gave his evidence cleanly. The fate, the speech, the sudden collapse, the absence of a pulse. Questioned by the coroner, he spoke of a preliminary examination and hinted at the possibility of a cardiac event. He was careful. A young man who had learned, perhaps, that a little vagueness was the safest course when the village was listening. Then Inspector Graves stood. In light of facts gathered, he said with importance, I sought the chemist's assistance and had certain articles sent to the county laboratory. A teacup, the remnants of tea. This morning's telegram reports a positive indication of poison arsenical in nature. A hush followed. Someone's breath caught and a chair creaked like a small, frightened animal. Mrs. Drayton pressed her handkerchief to her breast and whispered arsenic. as if she had invented the word. The coroner cleared his throat. In that case, we cannot return a verdict at once. I shall adjourn the inquest for a week, pending full analysis. His gaze traveled the room. In the meantime, the police will continue their inquiries. The assembly rose, murmuring. Outside, gossip blossomed as instantly and thickly as hawthorn after rain, poison arsenic. The word went down the street, in at the post office door, out at the baker's, through the inn, around the green and back again, each time picking up a little ornament of certainty. Miss Marple came out last. She paused a moment, looking not at people, but at the ground, at the faint track the two constables had made carrying their case of papers, at a darker mark just beside the side path that led behind the hall, at a smear on the brass latch, as if a conscientious hand had lately polished it a trifle too enthusiastically. She had noticed such a smear once before, Miss Marple. Inspector Graves bore down on her with a satisfied look that sat upon him like a new uniform. You heard the coroner. Poison. I've had my eye in the right quarter from the first. Have you, indeed? Said Miss Marple pleasantly. Men with quarrels, said Graves, lowering his voice. Men with easy access. You take my meaning. I do not doubt you have reasons, said Miss Marple, though I often find reasons and the truth are cousins who do not always dine together. Graveson looked as if he had been offered a riddle, and would much rather have had a compliment. You shall see, madame, he said, and went away with a briskness that suggested more certainty than patience. By 4 o'clock, this certainty disclosed itself. 2 constables climbed the lane to Mr. Fenton's farm. An hour later they returned with Mr. Fenton between them, the broad back a little stiffer than usual, the jaw set hard. The village, drawn as by a wire, appeared along the hedges. Mrs. Price emerged at her gate and made a surprised "Oh!" with her mouth. Mrs. Drayton told Mrs. Bantry, who already knew, that she had always said it would be a man's doing. At the inn corner, boys on bicycles shadowed the party at a respectful distance and relayed the progress to those who had remained planted, like century geraniums in their front gardens, in the parlor of the Crown and Pheasant, which had been drafted into temporary duty for official matters. Inspector Graves said in a voice almost benevolent with triumph, Thomas Fenton, I am arresting you on suspicion of the murder of Henry Hargreaves. He delivered the rest in a competent murmur. Fenton stood, a square man with earth ingrained in the lines of his hands, and a fury kept on a short leash behind his eyes. You're mad, he said. I never went near his tea. Graves laid a hand upon a small paper parcel on the table. Arsenical weed killer in your tool shed, and you shouting at the deceased 2 days before his death. You threatened him about the roof funds. Fenton's color mounted, and the whole village heard it. So I'd be the biggest fool in the county to go and poison him 2 days after. I told him he was a pompous, interfering, well, no matter. I never touched his tea, who can say? Graves returned, a little powder in a sugar bowl. Sugar. Fenton gave a harsh laugh. There's the humor of it. Henry Hargreaves would sooner put brimstone in his tea than sugar. Miss Marple, who had entered quietly and was studying the mantel clock, looked up at that. Inspector Graves looked at her also, and the pleasure on his face crumpled a fraction. Mr. Fenton, said Miss Marple, very mild, on the afternoon of the fete, where were you at 20 minutes to 4? In the livestock tent, he snapped, with the veterinary. Old Daisy had a swelling on the fetlock. The veterinary can confirm? Asked Miss Marple. He can, Fenton said, and then checked himself, as though he disliked being helped even by accuracy. Inspector Graves waved a hand. Plenty of time to step out, and it is not necessary that he pour the tea himself. The stuff could have been slipped in beforehand. Agitation makes the hand careless. A little extra dust, and no one the wiser. Miss Marple's expression grew cordially thoughtful, as though considering a new cake recipe. Agitation can make the hand careless, yes, she said, but also purposive. Pray, Inspector, who handled the tea at the crucial moment. Mrs. Price poured. The Armitage girl carried the tray, Graves said, and then, with relish, Fenton had been seen lurking along the side of the marquee earlier. Lurking, Fenton exploded. I was fetching a sack from the back gate for the tent pegs. There's a world of difference between lurking and labor. The weed killer, Mr. Fenton, said Graves, tapping the parcel. It lives in my shed, same as it lives in every shed from here to Bourton, Fenton returned roughly. It kills bindweed, not solicitors. And had I wanted Hargreaves dead, I'd have told him so to his face and done it with a stick. Graves gave him a warning look. Miss Marple's eyes, however, held a fragment of sympathy. She had long observed that men of Fenton's sort, if they killed at all, did it in a manner congruent with their tempers. Subtlety sat upon them like lace on a scarecrow. Inspector, she said, forgive an old woman's obstinacy. If the poison lay in the sugar, then whoever placed it must have known. Not only that Mr. Hargreaves would take tea, but that contrary to his habit, he would take it sweet. That is a very particular knowledge. Would Mr. Fenton possess it? Graves stiffened. Any villager might have heard him ask that day. Miss Marple shook her head. He did not ask. I observed 2 lumps in the cup, but the request was never made. In fact, she smiled apologetically. The sugar beside the urn was in cubes, not loose. Cubes do not slip into a bowl they do not belong to. They must be chosen. Graves's mouth compressed. You are fond of your niceties, Miss Marple. They are only the small habits by which we live, said Miss Marple, and by which we sometimes die. He turned back to Fenton. You quarreled. You own the poison. A witness saw you near the tent. I have sufficient to proceed. And I, said Miss Marple, have a little doubt. She said it so gently that it did not sound like contradiction, only like the suggestion that perhaps it would be well to look for one's mislaid spectacles once more before walking to church. Graves signed to the constables. Fenton was taken away, the village breathing in satisfaction and out in scandal. It was a comfortable arrest, the sort that smoothed talk and satisfied the imagination. A blunt man, a public quarrel, a farmer's poisons. The narrative fitted like an old glove. Miss Marple returned home by the longer lane that passes the back of the hall. There were ruts in the soft earth, new since Monday. She bent, and with the small dexterity of old hands lifted a thread that had snagged on a splinter of the gate-post. Pale blue, very fine. Such threads escape the notice of men, because they cannot be listed in a charge sheet. She wrapped it primly in the corner of a handkerchief. A step sounded behind her. Mrs. Price, neat and fastidious, came along with a little start at seeing Miss Marple. Oh, you gave me a fright. Forgive me, my dear. A lovely afternoon, is it not? Mrs. Price glanced at the back latch of the hall. I was only coming to see that everything was properly shut. These places, people wander in, A public building often becomes more public than it ought, Miss Marple agreed. You were admirable at the urn on Saturday. Mrs. Price colored faintly. It was nothing. Only a woman's work, which is often the most important kind, said Miss Marple. So steady of you, except for that little tremble when the tray fell. A natural shock, Mrs. Price said sharply. Very natural. Miss Marple looked at the latch, which had a new shine. You're so tidy, my dear. I admire it excessively. There is nothing so wholesome as a Polish in the right place. Mrs. Price gave a small, fixed smile. I must be getting on, she said, and went with a haste that made haste seem ill-mannered. Miss Marple stood a moment longer. She remembered the smear on the back door after the fete and the Polish on the latch now. She remembered the raffle muddle Mr. Hargreaves had fretted over. She remembered Lucy's protestation. I only handed the cup. The small thread in her hand felt like a line cast out into a rather troubled pond. One never knew what would rise to the bait. That evening, Mrs. Bantry arrived, full of feeling. "My dear Jane, have you heard? The inspector has done it, Fenton. I always say men like that are dangerous when roused. His temper and the weed killer, really one could write it up oneself. Though I confess I did wonder, tea seems so well domestic." "Domestic," echoed Miss Marple, pouring tea. "It is odd, is it not, how men are so often taken with domestic things when they die? Puddings, soups, cups of tea. They rely upon the women who bring them. And women, when they wish to help or harm, choose very practical means." Mrs. Bantry looked at her keenly. "You don't believe it is Fenton?" Miss Marple smiled. "I believe almost anything for a moment. It saves time. But the moments do not last." "What do you think will not last now?" "The inspector's comfort," said Miss Marple, and sipped. Night fell soft upon Marleycombe, as if anxious not to disturb. Windows glowed and darkened. The inn-door shut early, yet the village did not rest. It listened to the idea of justice, which is a lullaby when it is neat, and a discord when it is true. Miss Marple set aside her cup and took out the little handkerchief. She laid the pale blue thread upon a white saucer, and regarded it as one might regard a wandering hare in a soup, a trifle, unpleasant, and very telling. Blue thread. Who in Marleycombe wore it that day? Not Mrs. Drayton, whose best dress ran to plum. Not Mrs. Price, fastidious in grey. Not Lucy, in her pale summer frock with a little white collar. But there had been another, hadn't there? A committee woman by the raffled table, in a blue cardigan with the pearl button missing. Miss Marple's face grew gentle and remote, as if she were thinking of a hymn tune. Down at the Crown and Pheasants, Inspector Graves wrote his report with gratifying strokes of the pen. He set the period after the words "sufficient evidence" with something like affection. He was a tidy man and liked a tidy line. Above him, in the small room where they had put Mr. Fenton, a floorboard spoke under a heavy foot, and silence followed. Graves did not hear it. He was attending to neatness. Miss Marple turned out her lamp. Her last thought before sleep was of a sugar bowl, and how often a habit is safer than any alibi. When habit is broken, someone has gone to trouble. And people do not go to trouble unless it is very much worth their while. The village of Marleycombe settled into an uneasy calm after Mr. Fenton's arrest. Shops opened, children played, hens clucked in their yards, but beneath the surface ran a ripple of satisfaction. People liked a neat story. A quarrelsome farmer, a quarrel with the victim, poison in the shed, such things fitted comfortably into the imagination. At the Crown and Pheasant, the men spoke of it over their mugs. "Hot temper, that's the truth," said the blacksmith. "He near raised his stick to Hargreaves last year over a boundary hedge. Mark me, he's a man who'd strike first and think later." Mrs. Drayton told Mrs. Price in the post office that she had always suspected. Fenton's temper would land him in trouble. Mrs. Price, lips thin with significance, agreed. It was bound to be him. I saw him hovering near the tea tent myself. The village wanted to believe it. Belief made life simpler. Yet belief and truth, Miss Marple reflected, were not the same. That evening, Miss Marple received Mrs. Bantry in her cozy sitting room. The fire glowed, the tea was hot, and seed cake stood ready on a plate. "Well, Jane," said Mrs. Bantry, settling herself, "I must say it is a relief. A horrid thing, of course, but better to have it settled quickly. Poor Henry Hargreaves, poised in his teacup, but with Fenton behind bars. At least we may breathe again." Miss Marple smiled gently. pouring. I wondered, Dolly, whether it is as settled as all that. Mr. Fenton, after all, is a man of action rather than subtlety. Mrs. Bantry raised her brows. Poison is subtle, I grant you. But he had the weed killer in his shed, and he quarreled with Hargreaves. What more do you want? Miss Marple set down the teapot. I want consistency. Human beings are often illogical, but their habits are surprisingly constant. Mr. Hargreaves never took sugar. You recall that? Why, yes. I've heard him say so. Yet his cup contained sugar, 2 lumps of it. That means someone must have put it there, knowing he would drink from that cup regardless. That strikes me as curious, does it not? Mrs. Bantry frowned. You mean it was not chance? I mean, said Miss Marple softly, that whoever poisoned him arranged for him to drink a cup he would normally have refused. That requires knowledge and a little planning. Does that sound like Mr. Fenton's way? Mrs. Bantry was silent a moment, the firelight flickering on her thoughtful face. You're right, Jane. He would have stormed, not schemed. The next day, Miss Marple paid a call at the vicarage. She found the vicar's wife in the drawing-room, surrounded by hymn books and committee papers. My dear Miss Marple, the vicar's wife exclaimed, you must help me. The fate accounts are in a dreadful muddle, and with poor Mr. Hargreaves gone, no one knows quite what to do. Miss Marple folded herself into a chair, needles clicking gently. Perhaps I might look them over, my dear. Sometimes an old pair of eyes notices what the busy ones miss. The papers, once examined, revealed curious things. Receipts for raffle tickets did not quite balance with the number sold. A sheet had been altered, figures rubbed and rewritten in a different ink. And here and there were faint pencil marks, as though someone had drafted and then tried to erase them. Poor Henry was always so particular, said the vicar's wife helplessly, but he did complain about missing tickets. Perhaps they were only miscounted. Or perhaps, Miss Marple said very gently, someone profited by them. The vicar's wife gasped. Oh, Miss Marple, you don't mean theft? Miss Marple's needles clicked on. I mean only that temptation comes in many forms. Even a raffle ticket may hold it. That afternoon, walking through the village, Miss Marple passed Lucy Armitage's cottage. The girl herself was in the small garden, clipping roses with unsteady hands. How are you, my dear? Miss Marple asked kindly. Lucy's eyes filled. Oh, Miss Marple, everyone thinks I'd carried the poised cup. They whisper about it. Even Dr. Leslie says I mustn't mind the talk, but how can I not mind? I never meant any harm. Of course you did not, Miss Marple soothed. But you did hand the cup, did you not? Yes, but Mrs. Price poured it. I only gave it to Mr. Hargreaves. I didn't even look inside. Miss Marple's gaze softened. And yet, my dear, you have suffered for it. Did Mr. Hargreaves ask for sugar? No, Lucy whispered. He never did. But when I gave him the cup, I thought it looked darker somehow. I wondered if it had sugar, but I couldn't change it, then could I? It would have been rude. Quite right, said Miss Marple, nodding. Very right indeed. Thank you, Lucy. She left the girl calmer, but her own mind was sharper than ever. Lucy had confirmed it. The sugar was deliberate. That evening, Inspector Graves called on Miss Marple, his mustache bristling with pride. Well, ma'am, the case progresses. Fenton has been remanded. The evidence is sound. Quarrels. Poison in the shed. No alibi worth a fig. Miss Marple poured him tea with innocent hands. And the sugar, Inspector? Graves frowned. Sugar? What of it? Only that Mr. Hargreaves never took it. Yet his cup had it. I wonder who would know that, and yet contrived to make him drink it anyway. The inspector waved his hand a trifle. Fenton could have tossed it in without thinking, but why should he? Miss Marple asked softly. It made the cup peculiar, different from what Mr. Hargreaves expected, unless the cup was meant for him specifically. Graves set down his cup with a snap. You women and your trifles. Men commit crimes because they quarrel and they own poison. That's the gist of it. Miss Marple smiled gently. Sometimes, Inspector, but not always. The larger facts may point one way, while the small consistencies point another. And I, you see, have always found human beings revealed themselves in their small consistencies. Graves muttered something about old ladies with fancies, and took his leave. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting in her lap, her thoughts orderly as stitches. Fenton's arrest comforted the village, but it comforted her not at all. He had quarrels, yes, he had poison, yes. But his temperament was not that of a man who schemed with sugar lumps. No, there was another hand here. Someone tidy, someone precise, someone who polished latches until they gleamed in altered figures with careful ink, someone who wanted Mr. Hargreaves silenced because of money, perhaps, or secrets hidden in the raffle accounts. Miss Marple drew her shawl about her shoulders. A hearth is warm, but doubt is colder than any draught, and her doubts about Thomas Fenton were strong indeed. The week after Fenton's arrest, Marleycombe wore an air of strained composure. On the surface, daily life continued. Milk bottles clinked on doorsteps. The bell ringer pulled the ropes for evensong. The school children marched in pairs up the lane. But beneath the calm, suspicion threaded its way through parlors and gardens like bindweed, entangling every conversation. For Marleycombe was not content with the inspector's neat conclusion. Gossip, like ivy, thrives best when it finds a wall to cling to. And in Marleycombe there were many walls. On Monday morning, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Drayton. The woman received her in a parlor heavy with lace and stuffed with embroidered cushions. Tea was poured into fragile cups painted with violets. Such a relief, Jane, to have it all explained, Mrs. Drayton said, though her eyes darted too quickly to her guest's face. Fenton was always quarrelsome. I'd never liked his manner, and to think he had poison right there in his shed. Miss Marple sipped delicately. Very true, my dear. And yet quarrels and poison are not so uncommon in villages, are they? Mrs. Drayton pursed her lips. I should hope poison is not common, Jane. Oh, not poison, precisely, Miss Marple agreed with a smile. But the sorts of feelings that lead to it, resentment, envy, pride, we are none of us so different from the wider world. Only our motives tend to bloom in smaller gardens. Mrs. Drayton looked flustered. She fidgeted with her handkerchief, then said suddenly, well, if you ask me, the man was meddling far beyond the fate. Henry Hargreaves interfered in everything. Why, he even had the audacity to pry into my husband's accounts. It was intolerable, indeed, Miss Marple said softly. That must have been trying. Husbands, you know, can be careless at times. I often think wives carry the heavier share of respectability. Mrs. Drayton flushed. Well, yes, but really, Jane, to accuse my husband. It was a scandal. Henry could not leave well enough alone. Miss Marple let the subject drift politely, but she stored the words away. Rivalries in Marleycombe, she thought, were like roses, sweet on the surface, thorny beneath. Later that day, Miss Marple stopped at the post office. Mrs. Price was behind the counter, trimming a sheet of stamps with precise scissors. She looked up with brisk composure. Good morning, Miss Marple. Another fine day, though it may turn. Indeed, my dear, Miss Marple said pleasantly. I was just thinking of Saturday week at the fete. Such a pity. Mr. Hargreaves's last hours were so public. You must have been very distressed, pouring the tea as you did. Mrs. Price's lips tightened. I did my duty. Accidents will happen, of course. And such steady hands you have. Something flickered in Mrs. Price's eyes. I do my work properly, Miss Marple, not like some. Miss Marple tilted her head. You mean Lucy Armitage? A sniff. The girl hovers. Always hanging about the doctor. And he, a respectable man, Ought to keep his distance. But she is useful to him, running errands. I dare say she would do anything, he asked. Too much admiration is unhealthy. Miss Marple thanked her, purchased her stance, and departed with a small inward sigh. Jealousies, she reflected, were not confined to young hearts. Women past their prime often carried sharper resentments than those still hopeful of romance. That evening at the vicarage, Miss Marple joined a small gathering round the fire. The vicar, his wife, Mrs. Bantry, and Dr. Leslie, who had dropped in with his bicycle leaning against the gate. The talk, inevitably, turned to Henry Hargreaves. Dr. Leslie was animated. The man was obstinate. I had nearly secured funds for a new surgery building, a proper place, clean, modern, and then Hargreaves opposed it. Said the money should be spent on repairing the church roof, as though a leaking roof were more important than proper medicine. The vicar cleared his throat. The roof is very necessary for the preservation of the building, but not more necessary than lives, Dr. Leslie retorted. I told Hargreaves so in plain terms. I dare say I spoke heatedly. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Heated words are easily spoken, doctor, but they seldom poison cups of tea. Dr. Leslie gave her a startled glance, then laughed uneasily. Quite right, Miss Marple. Still, he thwarted everything I tried to do, and that kind of obstruction, well, it drives a man to distraction. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. So many had quarrels with him. Fenton, Mrs. Drayton, now you. One wonders how he managed to live as long as he did. Miss Marple murmured, "It is sometimes dangerous to be universally disliked." The fire crackled. No one spoke for a moment. 2 days later, Miss Marple attended a meeting of the Women's Institute in the church hall. The business of jam sales and knitting patterns was briskly conducted, but afterward the ladies lingered in little knots, their voices dropping. "I heard," whispered Mrs. Simpkins, "that Mr. Hargreaves had a lady friend in Bourton. Quite improper, if you ask me. What respectable solicitor lives 2 lives?" "Nonsense," sniffed Mrs. Bartlett. "It was his niece visiting from town. People will say anything." Miss Marple, in her quiet chair, absorbed it all. She had long learned that gossip contained both lies and truths, but the mixture often revealed the shape of something important. A niece or a lady friend? Either way, someone from outside Marleycombe had shadowed Mr. Hargreaves's life, and secrets from outside, Miss Marple knew, often pressed hardest upon those within. That evening, Lucia Armitage came again, pale and trembling. "They think it's Fenton," she whispered, "but I don't believe it. He's rough, yes, but he isn't sly. And someone is sly, Miss Marple. Someone wanted Henry Hargreaves out of the way. Do you know what I heard? He was about to expose someone's theft. He had written notes papers, but they're gone. His desk was searched after he died, and the papers weren't there." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Gone, you say?" "That is very interesting." Lucy twisted her handkerchief. "Do you think, could it have been Dr. Leslie if Henry opposed him about the surgery?" Miss Marple laid a hand over hers. "Hush, my dear. Suspicion is like fire. It spreads quickly and often burns the innocent. We must have patience. The truth shows itself, given time." But in her own mind, Miss Marple considered Lucy's words gravely. Missing papers, altered raffle accounts, a polished latch, sugar in the wrong cup. Hall suggested a hand careful, deliberate, tidy. And tidy hands often belong to those most trusted. On Saturday, the village green was quieter than usual. The fate bunting had been taken down, leaving only faint scars on the posts. People passed one another with wary nods. Children sensed the change. Their games were subdued. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. At her garden gate, Miss Marple paused to look across the lane. Mrs. Price was returning from the hall, her gloves neat, her step brisk. In her hand she carried a ledger. She caught sight of Miss Marple and raised the book slightly. "Committee accounts," she said. "I keep them in order, now that Henry is gone. Someone must." Miss Marple inclined her head. "How fortunate the committee is to have so careful a guardian." Mrs. Price smiled, a thin, satisfied smile. "Careful work is the only kind worth doing." She passed on. Miss Marple watched her go, eyes thoughtful. Rivalries in Marleycombe had indeed begun to bloom, over money, over love, over respectability. And the roots of those rivalries ran deep. Miss Marple returned indoors, lit her lamp, and set her knitting in her lap. The pattern grew beneath her fingers, neat and inevitable, but her thoughts ran elsewhere. To Henry Hargreaves, dead among the bunting, to the sugar in his cup, to the missing papers, to the tidy, careful hand that had contrived it all. "Human nature," she murmured to herself, "is like a garden. One must look not only at the roses, but at the weeds. It is often the weed that chokes the root." The Sunday bells rang clear across Marleycombe, but their sound carried less comfort than usual. Villagers still came dutifully to the service, bonnets, gloves, hymn books in hand, but there was a tension beneath their solemnity. Glances strayed sideways, whispers stirred, and the shadow of Henry Hargreaves seemed to sit in the pews more firmly than the living. Miss Marple attended as she always did, neat in her dark hat, her hymn book carefully marked with a ribbon. She sang the psalms in her thin, steady voice, and watched, as much as listened, the congregation around her. For church, she knew, was a place where truth and pretense often rubbed shoulders. Mrs. Price sat very upright, lips pursed, eyes closed in exaggerated reverence. Lucia Armitage, pale and nervous, sat near the front with Dr. Leslie. Mrs. Drayton fluttered a lace fan, though the air was not warm. Inspector Graves, unusually punctual, occupied a seat at the aisle, mustache bristling with importance.
Yep.
It was only after the service, when the villagers milled in the churchyard, exchanging murmurs, that Miss Marple noticed the curious thing. Mrs. Bartlett was saying to Mrs. Simpkins, "A fine sermon. The vicar always speaks so movingly after tragedy. And that hymn, 'Abide with me,' so perfectly chosen. It must have brought comfort to poor Mr. Hargreaves's family." "Yes, indeed," agreed Mrs. Simpkins fervently. "I remember it at my cousin's funeral. So solemn, and beautifully sung today." Miss Marple's pale eyes rested quietly on them. "Forgive me, my dear," she said gently, "but I do not believe we sang 'Abide with me' at all this morning, nor last Sunday either." The ladies blinked, nonplussed. "Why, of course we did," Mrs. Bartlett insisted, just before the sermon. But Miss Marple shook her head kindly. "I marked the hymns as always. We sang, 'O God, our help in ages past, Rock of ages, and the day thou gavest.' No other." The women looked embarrassed, murmured something about confusion, and drifted away. Miss Marple stood still a moment, her knitting bag over her arm, her mind sharpening. It was not the hymn that mattered, it was the memory of it. Someone had said, during the confusion at the fete, that Mr. Hargreaves had remarked on "Abide with me" being sung that afternoon. But if the hymn had not been sung, then the remark could not have been made, which meant either the speaker had lied or had invented a memory to cover their movements. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call at the Bantries. Colonel Bantry was in the garden, fussing over dahlias, while Mrs. Bantry received her friend in the drawing-room. "I must tell you, Jane," Mrs. Bantry began. "Everyone says Fenton is guilty as sin. Graves is crowing over it, but I cannot feel easy. The man blusters, yes, but poison, it seems too deliberate." Miss Marple nodded, pouring tea. "And I have come across something very curious. Do you remember, at the fete, Mrs. Price said she distinctly heard Mr. Hargreaves humming 'Abide with me' just before he collapsed?" "Yes, indeed, I recall her saying so." "Well, Dolly, We did not sing that hymn. Not at all. Mrs. Bantry's eyes widened. But then how could she have heard it? Precisely. Either she misremembered, a natural slip, though a convenient one, or she wished us to believe a scene that never happened. I find such errors most instructive. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. Then you suspect her, Jane? I suspect, said Miss Marple softly, that in Marleycombe, absence may speak louder than presence. An event that did not occur can be as revealing as one that did. The next morning, Miss Marple visited Lucy again. The girl was pale, her eyes shadowed. They think it's over, Lucy whispered. But it isn't, is it? I know it isn't. People still whisper about me, Miss Marple, about me handing him the cup. Miss Marple laid a hand gently on hers. My dear child, the truth is never so simple as one cup. But tell me, do you recall what hymn was sung before Mr. Hargreaves collapsed? Lucy frowned. Why, I think? Wasn't it Abide With Me? Miss Marple shook her head. No, that hymn was not sung. I wonder, Lucy, who told you it was? Lucy looked troubled. Mrs. Price said so, I think. She said she heard him humming it. Did she now? Miss Marple said quietly, That is very helpful, my dear. Thank you. By Wednesday, talk of the hymn had spread, though most laughed it off as a trifle. Only Miss Marple treated it with gravity. She had learned long ago that human lives were like lace doilies, decorative, often fragile, but carefully placed to cover a stain beneath. On Wednesday evening, Miss Marple invited the vicar's wife to tea. The conversation turned, as expected, to village matters. My dear, Miss Marple asked innocently, do you keep the list of hymns chosen for the fete service? Oh, yes, certainly, said the vicar's wife, bustling to a drawer. Here it is, Rock of Ages, the day thou gavest, and the children sang all things bright and beautiful, nothing else. Miss Marple examined the list with a mild smile. Thank you. Then we may be quite sure Abide With Me was not sung. The vicar's wife nodded, then frowned. But why does it matter, Miss Marple? Because, my dear, someone has insisted it was. And when people insist upon things that are not true, one must ask why. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, the quiet ticking of the clock accompanying her thoughts. She reviewed the patterns so far. Sugar in the tea where none should be. A polished latch suggesting hands that tidied evidence. Missing raffle papers. Accounts altered. And now a hymn that had not been sung, yet was sworn to. The pattern was becoming clearer. Someone careful, someone tidy, someone who would think to supply a memory that covered a gap in time. Someone who wanted the village to believe a story that gave them innocence. Miss Marble's needles clicked as she thought. Evidence of absence. That was always the most difficult kind, for people were reluctant to believe in nothing. Yet absence could prove more fatal to a lie than presence ever did. She thought of Mrs. Price's neat hands, her tidy accounts, her sudden tremor at the fate. She thought, too, of Lucy's eagerness to defend herself, and Dr. Leslie's frustration over funds, and Mrs. Drayton's resentment at Henry. Hargreaves's probing, so many motives, so many tempers, but only one had offered a memory that could not be true. People may invent excuses, Miss Marple murmured to herself, but they cannot invent hymns. The following morning brought a new ripple through the village. Word spread that Inspector Graves had discovered no direct evidence linking Fenton to the tea, the weed killer, yes, the quarrel, yes, but no proof that he had ever touched the urn or the cups. Still, Graves remained certain. Motive means opportunity, he said stoutly at the inn. That's the triangle. Everything else is embroidery. Miss Marple, sipping her tea nearby, said nothing. But she thought of embroidery, and how often women used it to disguise a tear in the fabric. And she thought of Mrs. Price, whose embroidery always covered too much. That night, as she set down her knitting, Miss Marple looked into the fire. The evidence of absence was often overlooked. Yet here it stood as clearly as if written on paper, a hymn not sung, a memory that should not exist. And with that absence, Miss Marple knew, the case against Thomas Fenton was no longer merely weak. It was false. The morning after the hymn discovery, Marleycombe awoke to rain. A slow, steady drizzle darkened the thatch, blurred the hedgerows, and turned the green into a spongy carpet. The drizzle did little to dampen village talk, however. If anything, it forced more people indoors together, where gossip brewed stronger than tea. Miss Marple, never deterred by weather, tied her shawl firmly and set out toward the vicarage. On the way, she passed the committee hall, its doors locked, its windows glistening with rain. A ladder leaned oddly against the side near the back entrance. Miss Marple paused. It was not unusual to see ladders. Of course, village halls always needed some repair, but she remembered distinctly that the ladder had been kept in the shed behind the inn. Why was it here now, in the wet, with no one about? And why placed so that it reached precisely to the small rear window above the storeroom, a window ordinarily left fastened? She filed it away in her mind, as she always did with such small anomalies. At the vicarage, the vicar's wife was in distress over committee papers. "My dear Miss Marple, what are we to do? The accounts are in dreadful order. Henry Hargreaves must have had papers concerning the missing raffle tickets, but they vanished, not a trace." Miss Marple examined the small pile of ledgers and receipts spread across the table. Her pale eyes noted smudges of ink, alterations in different handwritings. But what caught her attention most was a scrap of paper lodged beneath the inkwell. She drew it out delicately. It was torn, no larger than a playing card. But on it remained a few words in Henry Hargreaves's distinctive hand. "Not accounted for. Dangerous, if revealed. Must be spoken of at once with P." Miss Marple tucked it gently back under the inkwell. "It seems Henry intended to confront someone," she said mildly, "perhaps on the very day of the fete." The vicar's wife gasped. "Then, perhaps that is why," Miss Marple nodded. "It is seldom only chance when men with secrets die suddenly." Later that day, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Bantry. Together they examined the scrap. "P," Mrs. Bantry said thoughtfully. "Price? Could it be Mrs. Price? She has her finger in everything, post office, committee funds." "Possibly," Miss Marple murmured, "or another." But Henry was a man precise with words. If he wrote P, he meant something quite definite. It would be unwise to leap. Mrs. Bantry shook her head. "So many secrets, Jane, and all covered with such neatness. I dare say whoever killed him has covered their tracks very carefully indeed." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly, "though tidy work is often more revealing than careless work. A smear polished too much, an account too neatly adjusted. Such things call attention, if one is used to watching." The rain cleared by evening. Miss Marple, restless, walked once more by the committee hall. The ladder still leaned against the wall. This time she looked more closely. Mud clung to the rungs, and near the base, pressed faintly into the softened earth, was the mark of a small, neat shoe. Not a man's heavy boot, but something lighter. A woman's, perhaps, or a young person's. She bent and touched the mark, thoughtful. As she straightened, Lucy Armitage appeared, hurrying along with a basket. She stopped at the sight of Miss Marple. "Good evening, my dear," Miss Marple said gently. "A damp night for errands." "Yes, I was only fetching bread for Dr. Leslie. He's had a long day." Lucy hesitated, then glanced nervously at the ladder. "Strange, isn't it, standing there like that?" "Strange indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Tell me, Lucy, do you know who has the key to the committee hall?" "Mrs. Price, I think. She keeps the spare." but I suppose anyone could fetch the ladder from the inn if they wished. Lucy's eyes flickered. You don't think? Miss Marple patted her arm. I think only that ladders seldom move themselves, and secrets seldom remain locked away forever. The following morning brought a small stir in the post office. Mrs. Price, trim and efficient, was seen carrying a bundle of papers into the back room. When she returned, her hands bore faint traces of ink, hastily wiped. Miss Marple, standing at the counter for stamps, remarked mildly, "A busy morning, my dear." Mrs. Price stiffened. "Committee business. One must keep accounts in order, you know. Not everyone can manage figures correctly." "Very true," Miss Marple said. "It is fortunate Henry was always so careful. His handwriting, for instance, quite unmistakable." For a moment, Mrs. Price's eyes darted to the ledger she had carried. Then she composed herself. "Yes, though a pity his notes were often so untidy. I shall make them clearer." Miss Marple inclined her head, but inwardly she thought, too tidy, perhaps. By midweek, the inspector announced he had new evidence. He declared triumphantly at the inn that the missing raffle proceeds had been traced to an error in Mr. Hargreaves's own record-keeping. "So you see," he said, mustache bristling, "all this talk of fraud is unfounded. Fenton had motive enough without it." The villagers nodded, satisfied. But Miss Marple, sipping her tea in the corner, remained unconvinced. She had seen the torn scrap in Henry's own hand, the anxious phrase, "dangerous if revealed." Henry had not been confused. He had been preparing to confront, and the torn paper had been hidden under an inkwell, not lost by chance. That evening she spread her knitting across her lap, the soft click of needles marking her thoughts. A ladder against a hall window, a neat footprint in the mud, a scrap of paper with a warning, addressed perhaps to P, and a woman tidied to the point of obsession, seen polishing latches, adjusting ledgers, rewriting accounts. Miss Marple allowed herself a sigh. "Too tidy," she murmured. And when things are too tidy, one must always look for the untidiness they conceal. 2 days later, Miss Marple invited Lucy to tea. The girl arrived, anxious as ever, twisting her gloves. "Miss Marple, you won't think badly of me, will you? But I saw Mrs. Price last night near the hall. She had a lantern and she was going in by the side door. She told me she was fetching committee papers, but I thought it was late, and the ladder was still there." Miss Marple nodded. "That is very useful to know, my dear. Thank you." Lucy leaned forward. "Do you think it was her, Miss Marple? Do you think she killed him?" Miss Marple patted her hand. "I think, childs, that people often condemn themselves, given time. All one must do is watch and wait for the moment they tidy away too much." That night Miss Marple sat alone by her fire. The rain had returned, tapping softly against the window. She thought of Henry Hargreaves, bending over his papers, pen scratching the words, "dangerous if revealed." She thought of the ladder, oddly placed, of the footprint in the mud, of the hymn never sung, yet sworn to, and she thought of Mrs. Price, always so neat, so composed, so certain of her own respectability. Respectability, Miss Marple knew, could be the finest mask of all. But masks slipped eventually, and when they did, the truth beneath was never tidied. By the week's end, Marleycombe had grown weary of its own whispers. Theories had bloomed and faded like mushrooms, each more extravagant than the last. Some swore Fenton's temper had finally boiled over. Others insisted Lucy Armitage's pale face betrayed guilt. Still others hinted darkly at Dr. Leslie, thwarted in his grand plans for a new surgery. Miss Marple listened to it all, as she always did, with her gentle half-smile and her knitting needles clicking. But her thoughts ran deeper, For the more she reflected on Henry Hargreaves's last moments, the more one detail troubled her: the tea. Everyone had assumed that the poison lay in the cup, slipped into the liquid, dissolved in sugar, stirred unnoticed. Inspector Graves, so fond of neatness, had declared it as good as proven. But Miss Marple's mind returned again and again to that small incongruity. Henry Hargreaves never took sugar, yet his cup had contained 2 lumps. It was not simply that the sugar was unusual. It was that the whole scene had been contrived to make the poison appear in the tea. And contrivance, Miss Marple knew, was often a mask. That Friday she took tea at the Bantrys'. The Colonel was grumbling about potatoes, but Mrs. Bantry was keen to discuss the case. "Jane, I declare I shall never drink tea again, without suspicion. Do you suppose we shall all be poisoned next? Such a horrid business." Miss Marple stirred her cup. "My dear Dolly, have you ever noticed how men take their tea differently at different times? With milk or without, strong or weak, sometimes lemon. Habits vary with circumstance." Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Yes, I suppose so. Though Henry Hargreaves always insisted on lemon, didn't he?" "Precisely," Miss Marple said softly. "Lemon. And yet, on the day of the fete, there was no lemon on the table. Only milk and sugar." Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Then he must have noticed, perhaps. Or perhaps someone noticed for him and took advantage of it." She sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. The next day, Miss Marple visited the vicarage. She asked the vicar's wife very gently, "Tell me, my dear, who was responsible for arranging the refreshments at the fete?" "Oh, Mrs. Price, of course. She is always so efficient. She ordered the cakes, arranged the urn, saw to the cups. I had only to make sandwiches and lemon?" The vicar's wife looked surprised. "I dare say she forgot, or perhaps it was not delivered. But Henry was particular about it, I know. He always complained if there was none." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, I thought as much." That afternoon she met Dr. Leslie by chance on the lane. He was weary, his bicycle splashed with mud. "Miss Marple," he said, stopping, "this business must end. Graves insists on Fenton, but it won't do. It is too simple. And Lucy, poor child, she suffers from every whisper." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "Doctor, tell me, did you notice whether Henry Hargreaves drank his tea quickly or slowly?" Leslie frowned. "Quickly, I suppose. He was speaking, raised his cup, and within a minute he collapsed." "Why?" "Because," said Miss Marple gently, "tea does not always taste the same. And Henry was particular. He would have noticed sugar at once and complained. Yet he did not, which means perhaps it was not the tea at all." Leslie looked startled. "Not the tea? But then what?" "That," Miss Marple said softly, "is the question." That evening, Miss Marple examined her own tea things with care. She poured a cup, stirred sugar into it, tasted. The sweetness was obvious, unmistakable. No man so particular as Henry Hargreaves would have swallowed half the cup without comment, unless the poison had not been in the tea at all. She looked at the plate of cakes beside her, at the sandwiches neatly cut, at the jug of milk. A memory stirred. At the fete, Mrs. Drayton's prize sponge had been proudly displayed. Mrs. Price had hovered near the cake table, rearranging plates. And Henry Hargreaves, she remembered clearly, had eaten a small slice of cake before raising his cup. On Sunday, Miss Marple spoke quietly with Mrs. Bantry again. "Do you recall, Dolly, whether Henry ate anything before he drank his tea?" Mrs. Bantry frowned. "Why, yes, I think so." "A slice of sponge." Mrs. Drayton pressed it upon him. She was so proud of winning the prize. "He took a piece to please her. I remember. because I thought at the time how thick she cut it." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Just so." "And if the poison were in the sponge?" Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Then the whole village is wrong. It was not the tea at all." "Precisely. It was never the tea. It was the cake." The following day, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Drayton. The woman was flustered, still speaking of her sponge. "It was ruined, Miss Marple, utterly ruined. No one remembers the prize now, only the tragedy. And Henry ate a piece, of course. He was always so fond of my baking." "Was he indeed?" Miss Marple said gently. "Yet I recall he seldom praised cake. He found it heavy, did he not?" Mrs. Drayton's cheeks flushed. "Nonsense. He admired it. Everyone did." Miss Marple smiled and took her leave. Henry Hargreaves had never been fond of cake. He had eaten that slice out of politeness. In eating it, had taken the poison. That night, Miss Marple sat long by her fire. She reviewed the pattern. Henry Hargreaves preferred lemon in tea, but none was offered. Sugar appeared in his cup, though he never took it. A distraction, perhaps, to draw suspicion toward the urn. In fact, the true poison might have been in the sponge cake, handed to him publicly, cutting off his chance to refuse. And who had hovered near both tea and cake? Mrs. Price. Who had spoken of the hymn that wasn't sung? Mrs. Price. Who now kept the committee papers too carefully tidy? Mrs. Price. Miss Marple folded her knitting. The net was tightening, but it was not yet time. For a trap to catch the truth must be set with patience. She leaned back, eyes twinkling faintly in the lamplight. "It was never the tea," she murmured. "And when one sees what was not, one begins to see what is." The drizzle it lifted, and Marleycombe lay in the pale, washed light of early spring. Yet the village seemed no cleaner in conscience than it had been the week before. Whispers trailed down lanes, suspicions seeped through walls, and the police patrols only stiffened tongues instead of silencing them. Inspector Graves, full of self-importance, announced in the Crown and Pheasant that he had collected conclusive statements from several key witnesses. He spoke of evidence as though he had arranged it neatly on a shelf, each piece labeled, dusted, and unquestionable. "Take Mrs. Price," he declared, mustache bristling, "an unimpeachable witness. At the time of the poisoning, she was serving tea under half the village's eyes. Not a soul could say she left her post for more than a moment. That is as strong an alibi as you will ever hear." The villagers nodded. They wanted certainty, and Graves provided it like sugar lumps dropped firmly into their doubts. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in a corner with her knitting, looked down at her needles. She remembered well Mrs. Price's account, given with neat precision, every minute accounted for. Too neat, she thought. Life seldom ran to such tidy schedules. That afternoon, Miss Marple invited Lucy Armitage to tea. The girl was pale, still nervous, but willing to talk. "Lucy, my dear, when Mrs. Price gave her evidence to the inspector, what exactly did she say?" Lucy frowned, trying to recall. "She said she poured tea for a dozen people in a room, Mr. Hargreaves among them. She said she never left the urn except once, when she passed the tray to me, and then she turned back at once. She insisted she was there the whole time." "Every minute?" Miss Marple pressed gently. "Yes. She described it almost exactly. Mr. Hargreaves took his cup, she said. She poured for Mrs. Bantry, for the vicar, and so on. She even remembered what each of them said. It was astonishing." Miss Marple nodded. "Astonishing indeed. People's memories are rarely so exact, unless, of course, they are rehearsed." Lucy's eyes widened. "You mean she practiced what to say?" "Perhaps." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "I have often observed that when people describe an event with unnatural precision, it is because they wish to persuade themselves as much as others. Real memory's patchy, my dear. It rambles. It forgets. Only performance has such polish. Later, Miss Marple stopped at the post office. Mrs. Price was there, of course, trim as ever, arranging envelopes with meticulous care. "Good day, my dear," Miss Marple said mildly. "I was just thinking how difficult it must be, recalling the fates so clearly. I confess my own memory is hazy." Mrs. Price gave a brisk smile. "Not mine. I could tell you exactly who came for tea and in what order. Mr. Hargreaves took his cup at precisely 10 minutes before 4. I remember because the vicar was just behind him, and he remarked upon the lateness of the hymn." Miss Marple's eyes rested gently on her. "So exact. You have the memory of a ledger." Mrs. Price's cheeks flushed faintly. "Well, one must be clear when giving evidence. Otherwise the police grow confused." "Quite so," Miss Marple said, and asked for stamps. But as she walked away, she thought, too clear, too exact. It has the sound not of recollection, but of rehearsal. That evening Miss Marple confided in Mrs. Bantry. "Dolly, have you ever noticed how people exaggerate their memories when they are determined to be believed? A child will swear he brushed his teeth and tell you the very minute, when in fact he forgot entirely. So too with grown-ups. An alibi that is too exact is very often no alibi at all." Mrs. Bantry frowned, but surely Mrs. Price was under everyone's eye. She could not have slipped away. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She need not have slipped away. The poison was not in the tea, but in the cake. And who hovered nearest the cakes, rearranging plates, insisting the slices be cut? Who was in the very position to add something beforehand, then perform the scene of tea pouring to perfection? Mrs. Bantry gasped. "Jane, you don't mean—" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I mean only that when a person insists too strongly upon their innocence, one must look more closely at the thing they insist upon. Innocence, like alibis, seldom requires rehearsal." The next day, Inspector Graves called on Miss Marple, brimming with self-congratulations. "Well, ma'am, it is, as I said. The witnesses corroborate Mrs. Price exactly. She was at her post, and Fenton was not. Motive, means, and opportunity still point squarely at him. The case is watertight." Miss Marple poured him tea. "And yet, Inspector, have you considered that being at her post was precisely what Mrs. Price wished everyone to remember?" Graves stiffened. "Are you suggesting she lied?" "I suggest only that she has given you a performance. People rarely recount events in such neat sequence. Real memory is untidy. It forgets small things. Yet, Mrs. Price's version runs smooth as a recital. That, Inspector, is not memory. It is rehearsal." Graves scowled. "You old ladies with your fancies. What do you suppose she rehearsed it for?" Miss Marble's pale eyes twinkled. "Why, for the very reason you find it so convincing. Because it is the kind of alibi a policeman longs to hear." That evening, alone by her fire, Miss Marple reviewed the pattern, a hymn remembered that was never sung, a latch polished too thoroughly, a scrap of paper warning of something dangerous if revealed, a ladder against the hall window with a woman's footprint, and now an alibi recited with unnatural clarity. Each by itself was nothing. Together, they formed a picture of a woman meticulous to the point of obsession, a woman who covered every detail, who polished her lies until they gleamed. Mrs. Price, Miss Marple thought, had not merely served tea, she had served a story. 2 days later, Lucy came running to Miss Marple's cottage, breathless. "They say the inspector is convinced Mrs. Price is the most reliable witness of all, that she proved the time of death." Miss Marple smiled gently. But proof, my dear, is a dangerous word. It often proves only that the speaker wished to be believed. I think, Lucy, that the inspector has been rather too well satisfied." Lucy's eyes widened. "Then it wasn't Fenton? You're sure?" Miss Marple laid her hand kindly over the girls. "I am sure only of this. When an alibi performs too well, it is no longer truth. And when people are too tidy, they often reveal more than they conceal." That night, Miss Marple set down her knitting with a decisive air. The time was nearing when she must set her own little trap. She knew required patience. They must be baited with the very thing the guilty most wished to protect, their appearance of innocence. She looked toward the window where the moonlight fell silver on her roses. "A perfect alibi," she murmured. "How curious. For perfection in human affairs is always suspect." Rain had swept through Marleycombe in the night, leaving the village lanes silvered with puddles. The green glistened, and the hedges dripped steadily. Yet if the village looked refreshed, the hearts of its people were anything but. Rumors now pressed close around Mrs. Price. Some admired her exactitude, calling her a tower of strength in committee matters. Others whispered she was too exact, too insistent on her innocence. And more than one villager remembered with discomfort her strange remark about the hymn that had never been sung. Miss Marple, seated by her parlor window with her knitting, listened as neighbors passed in the lane. She heard Mrs. Drayton muttering that Henry Hargreaves had been about to expose someone's fraud. She heard Lucy's light voice protesting, "I didn't poison anyone, I swear it." And she heard the butcher's boy declare stoutly that Mrs. Price is as neat as pins, but pins can prick. It was in this unsettled atmosphere that the second shock came. On Tuesday evening, Mrs. Bantry appeared at Miss Marple's door, flushed and excited. "Jane, you won't believe it. There's been a fire at the committee hall." Miss Marple set aside her knitting at once. "A fire, Dolly?" "Yes, only a small one, but quite enough to stir everyone up. Someone broke in by the back window. The caretaker found a pile of singed papers in the hearth. He says they were accounts committee ledgers." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Accounts, you say? How very particular." Mrs. Bantry nodded. "Graves is strutting about like a peacock, saying it proves. Fenton's guilt. He insists Fenton set the fire to cover his theft of the raffle money. But Fenton has been remanded in custody," Miss Marple said mildly. "Yes, of course, but Graves says an accomplice might have done it. Oh, Jane, it's such a muddle." The next morning, Miss Marple walked down to the hall. The back window indeed showed signs of tampering, the latch forced, a pane cracked. Inside, a scatter of charred paper lay near the hearth. The smell of smoke still clung faintly. Miss Marple bent to examine the ashes. Most were illegible, but one fragment survived, a margin with Henry Hargreaves's neat hand. The word deficit could just be made out. As she rose, Inspector Graves arrived, mustache bristling with self-satisfaction. "Ah, Miss Marple, you see it as I do, no doubt." Proof positive that Fenton, fearing exposure, had his friends burn the evidence. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Indeed, Inspector, but who in Marleycombe is so loyal to Mr. Fenton that they would risk breaking and entering for his sake? He is not the most beloved of men." Graves looked irritated. "Someone must have had reason. The point is, the evidence is gone." Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Not all of it, I think. Ashes, Inspector, are remarkably talkative if one knows how to listen." That afternoon, Lucy Armitage came running to Miss Marple's cottage, pale and trembling. "Oh, Miss Marple, I'm frightened." "It was Mrs. Price. I saw her near the hall last night before the fire. She had a lantern. She told me she was fetching papers. But I don't believe her." Miss Marple laid a calming hand over the girl's. "Hush, my dear. You have told me this before, and it is most helpful, but you mustn't excite yourself. People who act in haste often show more than they mean." Lucy twisted her handkerchief. "Do you think she'll harm me, Miss Marple? 'Cause I said I saw her?" Miss Marple's eyes softened. "You must be cautious, my dear, and I must be watchful. But do not fear. Truth, once roused, is stronger than lies. That night, Miss Marple invited the vicar's wife for tea. They spoke of the fire, of the papers destroyed. "My dear," Miss Marple asked gently, "do you recall who last held the committee ledgers before they vanished?" "Oh, Mrs. Price, of course. She took them from the vicarage only last week to make them tidy. She said Henry's notes were too untidy and needed to be clarified." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, too tidy, always too tidy." The vicar's wife looked puzzled. "But surely tidiness is a virtue?" "In households, yes," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "In evidence, no. The world, my dear, is not tidy. When it appears so, one must look for what has been swept under the rug." By Thursday, the village was in uproar. Inspector Graves marched about declaring the case closed. Fenton guilty, his accomplice unidentified. Yet the villagers were uneasy. Why had Mrs. Price been seen near the hall? Why were the papers she guarded so carefully now destroyed? Miss Marple walked slowly along the lane that evening, her eyes alert. She paused at the hall's back door. On the latch, still faint despite the polish, was a smear of soot, and near the base of the ladder, pressed into the damp soil, was once again the impression of a small, neat shoe. She bent and touched it. "A woman's step," she murmured, "always the same step." The second shock spread quickly through Marleycombe. People who had grown complacent after Fenton's arrest now whispered nervously, if the guilty one still walked free, who might be next? At the inn, Mrs. Drayton declared dramatically, "None of us is safe. Who knows what anyone might do to silence us?" At the grocer's, Mrs. Bartlett whispered that Lucy Armitage was in danger. At the post office, Mrs. Price stood pale and firm, declaring, "I have nothing to hide. My conscience is clear." But her hand, Miss Marple observed, trembled slightly as she counted out change. That night, Miss Marple sat by her fire, knitting, set aside. She reviewed the pattern once more. Henry Hargreaves dead, poised not by tea but by cake. Sugar added to his cup as a decoy. A hymn remembered that was never sung. A latch polished too much. A ladder against the hall window. A small footprint in the mud. A torn letter, warning of something dangerous, if revealed. And now a fire, neatly destroying the very papers Henry had kept. It was not coincidence. It was a deliberate chain, and each link bore the touch of the same tidy hand. Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. The time was nearly come to set her trap. For the second shock had made it plain, the killer was not done tidying. And tidiness, Miss Marple knew, was the very thing that would betray her. Marleycombe had not slept well since the fire. The villagers were uneasy, for the second shock had shaken even those most content to believe Fenton guilty. Windows were locked earlier, lamps burned longer into the night, and conversations in the lanes broke off suddenly when footsteps approached. Miss Marple, meanwhile, sat calmly in her cottage, knitting, needles flashing, as if nothing in the world disturbed her tranquility. But her thoughts were sharp. The net was nearly ready. Only one thing remained, to make the guilty hand reveal itself. On Thursday afternoon, she paid a call on Mrs. Bantry. The colonel was in the garden as usual, fussing over his dahlias, while Mrs. Bantry listened keenly as Miss Marple spoke. "Dolly, my dear," Miss Marple began, "I have been thinking. You know the papers Henry Hargreaves kept, the ones he said were dangerous if revealed?" "Yes." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward eagerly. "Destroying in the fire, poor things." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "So it seems. Yet I wonder what if a copy existed. Henry was careful. He might easily have made a duplicate. Imagine, Dolly, what the culprit would do if they thought such a copy had survived." Mrs. Bantry caught her breath. "Jane, you don't mean—" "I mean," said Miss Marple softly, that I intend to let it be known that such a copy has indeed been found. And we shall see who becomes uneasy." Mrs. Bantry clapped her hands in delight. "Oh, Jane, how clever!" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Not clever, my dear, only human nature. The guilty cannot bear the thought of unfinished business. They tidy, always they tidy, until at last they tidy themselves into a corner." The rumor began quietly. Mrs. Bantry mentioned it to the vicar's wife. The vicar's wife repeated it at the grocer's. Lucy whispered it anxiously at the post office. Within a day, half the village believed that a bundle of Henry Hargreaves's notes had been discovered among his effects. "Found in a drawer he had locked," said Mrs. Drayton, with relish. "Handed to Miss Marple for safekeeping," whispered the butcher's wife. "Delivered straight to the inspector," insisted Mr. Fenton's cousin at the inn. Each version differed, but the heart of the tale was the same. Henry's papers had not all perished. Somewhere damning words remained. Miss Marple herself said nothing. She sat calmly at her window, knitting, greeting passers-by with her usual mild smile. But she noted how Mrs. Drayton looked uneasy whenever the rumor was mentioned, how Dr. Leslie turned pale before laughing it off. Most of all, she noted Mrs. Price. Mrs. Price did not smile, did not laugh. She grew stiff, sharp, her lips thinner than ever. At the post office, she snapped at Lucy for dropping coins. At the vicarage, she insisted on inspecting the hymn lists herself. At the inn, she spoke loudly of Fenton's guilt, as if repetition could drown her own fears. Miss Marple saw it all. The bait had been taken. That Sunday, Miss Marple invited a small gathering to her cottage. Mrs. Bantry, the vicar and his wife, Lucy Armitage, and Dr. Leslie. Tea was poured, seed cake offered, and conversation turned, as expected, to the rumored papers. "I hear," said the vicar's wife, "that they contained the very names of those who misused the raffle money." Dr. Leslie looked startled. "Really? But then surely Graves would have arrested someone by now." Lucy leaned forward. "Miss Marple, do you truly have the papers?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Why, my dear, I cannot possibly say. But perhaps, in time, the truth will show itself." She glanced out the window. As she had expected, Mrs. Price was passing on the lane, pausing just a moment too long by the hedge. That evening, Miss Marple took her knitting to the vicarage and spoke quietly with the vicar. "My dear, could you arrange that tomorrow at the hall a meeting is announced, say to discuss Henry's papers? Let it be known the notes are to be read aloud. No need for detail, only the promise that they exist." The vicar blinked, but nodded. "If you think it wise, Miss Marple." "Wise or foolish, it will be revealing," she said. The announcement spread quickly. A meeting at the hall on Tuesday afternoon to discuss important papers concerning the fate accounts. No one knew precisely what papers these were, but the rumor sufficed. The village buzzed with excitement, fear, and speculation. On the day itself, the hall filled with villagers. The vicar took his place at the front. Miss Marple sat quietly in the back row, her knitting in her lap. Mrs. Price sat near the front, her face pale but composed, her gloves folded neatly in her lap. The vicar cleared his throat. "My friends, I am informed that certain papers of the late Mr. Hargreaves have survived, and that they contain remarks of importance to our committee. These papers will be read presently." He broke off suddenly, for a cry had risen from the front row. Mrs. Price had risen to her feet, trembling. "It is a lie," she cried. "There are no papers. They were destroyed. I mean, they must have been destroyed in the fire. No one has them, no one." The hall fell silent, all eyes fixed upon her. Her cheeks burned crimson, her hands clenched. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She had not needed the papers themselves. The guilty conscience had betrayed itself. After the meeting, Inspector Graves confronted Miss Marple outside. "What game is this, madam? You misled the village with false rumors? That is dangerous business." Miss Marple smiled. Not false, Inspector, merely incomplete. Henry Hargreaves did write papers. Whether they survived or not, I need not say. But you saw who could not endure the thought that they had? Graves scowled. Mrs. Price? She is a respectable woman? Respectability, Inspector, Miss Marple said gently, is often the finest camouflage for guilt. She feared those papers, and fear makes people clumsy. That evening, Lucy came to Miss Marple's cottage. You've trapped her, haven't you, Miss Marple? Mrs. Price. It was she all along. Miss Marple patted her hand. Hush, child, not yet. We have shaken the mask, yes. But to reveal the face beneath, we must be patient. There will be one more step. People who tidied too much always try to tidy again. And in that moment, the truth will stand plain for all. Alone by her fire, Miss Marple folded her knitting and reflected. The bait had been laid, and it had been taken. The guilty one had betrayed herself in the very act of trying to deny the existence of Henry's notes. The trap was nearly sprung. All that remained was to give the guilty just enough rope to tangle themselves completely. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly as she looked into the flames. A tidy woman, she murmured. But tidiness cannot survive disorder forever. And the truth, when it comes, is never tidy. It was a bright, brittle afternoon when Miss Marple requested a meeting at the vicarage. The word spread quickly. Miss Marple wished to speak, and when Miss Marple wished to speak, one listened. By tea time, the vicar's sitting room was filled. Colonel and Mrs. Bantry arrived first. The colonel puffing irritably, but his wife alert and eager. Dr. Leslie followed, grave and watchful. Mrs. Drayton fluttered in, anxious about her reputation. Lucy Armitage slipped into a corner, pale but determined. And last of all came Mrs. Price, neat as ever, her lips pressed thin, her gloves immaculate. Inspector Graves stood by the hearth, mustache bristling with skepticism. Now, Miss Marple, he said, what's all this? You've stirred up no end of gossip already. I trust you've for some reason for gathering us like this. Miss Marple sat in her usual place by the fire, knitting in her lap, her expression mild. Yes, Inspector. I believe the time has come to speak plainly. You see, Mr. Hargreaves's death was not the result of chance or temper. It was carefully planned, and the plan was meant to deceive us all. A stir ran through the room. Mrs. Drayton gasped. Dr. Leslie leaned forward. Mrs. Price sat very still. Miss Marple began quietly. From the first, the evidence seemed simple. Mr. Fenton quarreled with Henry. Hargreaves and poison was found in his shed. A convenient suspect, was he not? But the method was too subtle for him. He was a man of action, not deception. Poison, particularly in sugar, requires forethought, and Mr. Fenton's nature did not fit. Graves snorted. That's sentiment, not evidence, Miss Marple continued serenely. Then there was the tea. We all believed the poison lay in the tea, dissolved in the cup Mr. Hargreaves drank. Yet Mr. Hargreaves never took sugar. He would have noticed at once, but he did not. Why? Because the poison was not in the tea at all. It was in the cake. Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, Jane, you're right. He ate a slice of Mrs. Drayton's sponge first before he touched his cup. Mrs. Drayton cried out indignantly, My cake, how dare you? Miss Marple raised a hand. Not your cake as such, my dear, but the slice he was handed. It was easy enough to slip something into the sugar sprinkled on top. And who hovered near the cake table, rearranging plates, ensuring everyone had what they needed? Her eyes rested gently on Mrs. Price. The room stirred. Mrs. Price's hands clenched tighter around her gloves. Miss Marple went on, her voice calm and relentless. There were other clues. A hymn remembered that was never sung, a false Memory supplied to cover a gap in time. A latch polished until all trace was gone. A ladder against the hall and a neat footprint in the mud. A fire that destroyed precisely the papers Henry had written, warning of something dangerous. All the work of a tidy, careful hand. Her eyes, pale and unblinking, fixed once more on Mrs. Price. You, Mrs. Price, are known for your neatness. Your ledgers are exact, your stamps aligned, your accounts balanced to the penny. You could not abide Henry's disorder, and you feared what his papers might reveal about the raffle proceeds. You had opportunity at the fete, and you covered it with a performance of duty so exact it rang false. The silence deepened. Mrs. Drayton shifted uneasily. Dr. Leslie exhaled sharply. Lucy stared, wide-eyed. Inspector Graves blustered. Nonsense. Mrs. Price is a respectable woman. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Respectability, Inspector, is often the best disguise. But disguise slip when the pressure grows too great. At the hall, when we hinted Henry's papers had survived, Mrs. Price betrayed herself. She cried out that they must have been destroyed. No innocent woman would fear so desperately what they contained. Mrs. Price sprang to her feet, trembling. You twist everything. I was at the urn. Everyone saw me. I could not have touched the cake. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. But you did before the tea was poured. You arranged the plates, you cut the slices, and you placed one in particular at the front, knowing Mr. Hargreaves would accept it to please Mrs. Drayton. That slice was yours, Mrs. Price, yours and yours alone. Mrs. Price's face crumpled. Her gloves slipped from her hands. For a moment she swayed, then steadied herself with a bitter laugh. So clever, Miss Marple, so clever. Yes, I did it. It would have ruined me. He discovered the missing money, the little adjustments I made. Only a few pounds, but enough to disgrace me. Respectability, you say. Yes, I lived for it. I could not bear to be exposed. Her voice rose, sharp with fury. And so I poisoned him. I chose the fate because who would suspect among so many hands? I made it seem the tea, not the cake. I polished the latch, destroyed his papers, rehearsed my alibi, and still you saw through it all. She sank into her chair, trembling. The room was hushed. Lucy gasped. Mrs. Drayton sobbed. The colonel muttered in outrage. Inspector Graves sputtered. Confession or no, I'll have this properly taken down. But Miss Marple spoke gently. It is done, Inspector. You see now the truth. Henry Hargreaves was killed, not by temper, nor by chance, but by fear. The fear of exposure, the fear of losing respectability. That fear led Mrs. Price to murder, Graves muttered, but his face was pale. He had no choice but to summon his constables. When the room had emptied, Mrs. Bantry turned to her friend with shining eyes. Oh, Jane, how marvelous you were. To think you saw it all, when none of us had a clue. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It was nothing, Dolly, only human nature. People show themselves in trifles, in sugar where none should be, in hymns that were never sung, in accounts too neat, in alibis too exact. Respectability is a mask, and fear makes the mask slip. That is all. Mrs. Bantry shook her head in wonder. You are extraordinary, Jane, extraordinary. Miss Marple folded her knitting. No, my dear, merely observant. And very old. One sees much, living long enough. That night, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire with her needles at rest. Outside, the village lay quiet. Justice had been served, though at a cost. Respectability had proved a dangerous idol, and a tidy woman had killed to preserve it. Miss Marple sighed, looking into the flames. Life in Marleycombe would return to its quiet ways soon enough. Roses blooming, hens clucking, tea poured in china cups. But beneath the roses, as she had always known, lay roots tangled with secrets and shadows. The arrest of Mrs. Price sent shockwaves through Marleycombe. Respectability itself seemed to have crumbled. The neatest, most precise woman in the parish, the keeper of stamps and ledgers, should be a murderess. It was more than anyone could have imagined. For days the village buzzed with incredulous talk. At the Crown and Pheasant, men shook their heads over their pints. "Never would have believed it," muttered the blacksmith. "She balanced my accounts better than I ever could." At the post office, customers whispered in subdued tones, eyeing the new girl hastily installed behind the counter. In parlors and kitchens, women spoke half in pity, half in horror. "She did it for fear of shame," Mrs. Drayton declared, her eyes wide. "To think respectability could drive a body so far. I shall never look at ledgers again without suspicion." Miss Marple, hearing such remarks, only nodded mildly. She knew human nature better than most. Respectability, like love or money, could be a ruthless master. Inspector Graves strutted at first, claiming the case had been solved through steady police work, but even he grew quieter when confronted with how much he had overlooked. Colonel Bantry teased him mercilessly. "Steady police work, eh, Graves?" Yet it was Jane here, with her knitting, who saw straight through your watertight case. Graves muttered and retreated, though privately he admitted Miss Marple had outdone him once again. For Lucier's Armitage, the aftermath was bittersweet. She was cleared of suspicion at last. The whispers ceased, and villagers who had avoided her now offered sympathy. Dr. Leslie spoke kindly on her behalf at the inn, praising her courage. Yet Lucy's face still carried the shadow of what she had endured. "I owe everything to you, Miss Marple," she said one afternoon, clasping the old lady's hand. "If you hadn't believed in me, I don't know how I could have borne it." Miss Marple patted her gently. There, my dear. It was plain enough. A girl like you may be foolish at times, but not wicked. The two are very seldom confused, though people will insist they are." Lucy smiled through her tears. As for Thomas Fenton, his release brought its own scene. He emerged from custody grumbling loudly, insisting he had been wronged. "Arrested like a common criminal, all for what? Because I quarreled with Hargreaves? Everyone quarreled with him. I'll have the law on Graves for this." Yet beneath his bluster there was relief. Villagers nodded to him again, though some kept their distance. He was still a quarrelsome man, but no longer a murderer. Miss Marple, meeting him on the lane, gave her usual mild smile. "You see, Mr. Fenton, hot tempers may cause trouble, but true wickedness requires a cooler hand." "You were never the sort for subtlety," Fenton grunted. "Subtleties for women." And look where it landed. He shook his head. "Best to speak plain, even if it earns you enemies," Miss Marple agreed quietly. In the Bantry's drawing room, life resumed its accustomed rhythm. Mrs. Bantry bustled with gossip. Colonel Bantry fussed over his dahlias. Yet even here the case was not forgotten. "To think, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said one evening, "that Mrs. Price, of all people, should have done it. The hymn, the alibi, the papers. Why, it was all like a play, and you the playwright." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Not a playwright, Dolly. Only a watcher of plays. Human beings are much the same, whether in Marleycombe or St. Mary Mead. Pride, envy, fear, they write the same stories, merely with different names." Colonel Bantry grunted. "I dare say you're right, but if you ask me, there's nothing worse than a woman who polishes things too much. Give me a bit of dust any day, it's honest." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Very true, Colonel. Tidy appearances are often the most dangerous." The weeks passed, and the village returned to its rhythms. The church bell rang, hens scratched, roses bloomed. Yet a faint scar lingered, as scars always do. The Fate Committee was reformed with fresh members, more cautious than before. Accounts were checked twice, and in the churchyard where Henry Hargreaves was laid to rest, people passed with lowered voices. Life went on, but it had been reminded of its own fragility. One evening, Miss Marple sat in her parlor with Mrs. Bantry beside her. The fire glowed, the seed cake was nearly gone, and the air was peaceful. "You know, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said, "I cannot help thinking how like one of those dreadful detective stories this has been. A murder in a village, a shocking culprit, a clever reveal. Only this was real, and all the more unsettling for it." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knitting. "Yes, Dolly, it is unsettling, but it is life. Murder does not only happen in great cities or to great men. It happens here, among roses and hedgerows, at fêtes and tea tables. Because murder, in the end, is only human nature pushed too far." Mrs. Bantry shivered. "And you, Jane, see it all." Miss Marple smiled gently. "One sees what one is accustomed to, my dear. In a village you see the same little dramas repeated endlessly, jealousies, quarrels, little thefts, foolish pride. And once you have seen the pattern often enough, you recognize it, even when it grows larger and darker. That is all." Later, when Mrs. Bantry had gone, Miss Marple sat alone. The house was quiet, the fire low. She thought of Mrs. Price, alone in her cell, her gloves taken from her, her neatness powerless now. She thought of Henry Hargreaves, lying cold in the churchyard, his tidy papers turned to ashes. And she thought of Lucy, young and pale, finding her courage again. Human nature, Miss Marple reflected, was both weak and strong. Weak in its fear of shame, its greed for money, its hunger for control. Strong in its endurance, its capacity for kindness, its resilience in the face of tragedy. She drew her shawl closer about her shoulders. Outside, the wind stirred the roses in her garden. She smiled faintly to herself. "Murder in an English village," she murmured. "One might think it impossible. Yet, as I have always said, wickedness is no stranger, even under the roses." And with that, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking softly, as calm and inevitable as the passage of time itself.